Hello and welcome to this Oxford Analytica webinar entitled Elections, Policy Shifts and Geopolitics in Asia. I'm Adam Ward, Managing Editor at Oxford Analytica. Please note that this webinar will be recorded and made available to Oxford Analytica clients via our website. As usual in these webinars, we strongly encourage you to submit questions via the Q&A function that's at the bottom of the screen. If you don't wish to be identified by name when you're asking a question, then please just tick send anonymously. Our objective in this webinar is to assess a spate of recent and forthcoming elections across 3 Asian sub-regions. In Southeast Asia, elections were held in Myanmar on the 25th of January and Thailand on the 6th of February. In South Asia, polls were held in Bangladesh a few days ago, and elections are scheduled for Nepal on the 5th of March. And in East Asia, legislative polls for the lower house took place in Japan on February the 8th. I think a common feature of all of those elections is that they were, or are being, preceded either by extended periods of political instability or policy paralysis or international tensions, and in some cases by a combination of all 3 of these. And to that extent, their outcomes touch on a quite wide range of issues. So in the next hour, we'll look to split our conversation into a couple of parts. In the first half of the webinar, we'll look at the politics themselves. That's the background, the platforms, the outcome, and then we'll turn to the policy implications for the future, whether on the economy, for questions of reform, or for possible constitutional changes. In the second half of the webinar, we'll then turn our attention to the foreign policy questions at stake. In other words, how do these elections fit into the wider mosaic of regional geopolitics, and how will they impact key bilateral relationships, especially with some of the major powers? And where possible, we'll look to identify some common threads between these various elections. And to do all this, I'm very pleased to be joined by 2 colleagues from Oxford Analytica. First, Dr. Joydeep Sen, Deputy Director of Analysis and Senior Analyst for Asia, and he's going to be talking to us about Myanmar, Thailand, Bangladesh, and Nepal. And Thomas Shipley, East Asia Analyst, who will be looking at Japan. So Joydeep, if I could first turn to you, please. 4 elections on your patch. Could you take us through them, the circumstances, the process, the results, and the prospects, please?
Absolutely, yeah. So as Adam suggested, I'll talk about the several key elections that have either taken place recently or will take place soon in South and Southeast Asia, in Myanmar, Thailand, Bangladesh, and Nepal. In each case, the polls were called amid extraordinary circumstances. And yeah, I think there are important implications to consider in terms of not only domestic politics, but also international relations. But I'll begin with a fairly swift rundown of some basic details regarding these elections. In other words, the context in which they were called, and in the case of 3 of the polls, the results. And then once I've done that, maybe we can come back to the domestic policy. But let's start with Myanmar. The Myanmar general election, which was long promised by the junta that took power after the 2021 coup, was held in 3 phases, on December 28, January 11, and January 25, respectively. The staggered approach was mainly due to the logistical challenge of holding polls amid the ongoing civil war, which began soon after the coup and pits the military against various armed opponents. Now, the authorities set the date for the initial phase in August, quelling doubts about whether they would persist with their poll plans. Then in October, it was announced that it would not be possible to hold the polls in all parts of Myanmar, confirming what was already widely recognized, since the military lacked and continues to lack control over much of the country. Now, both houses of parliament, which have equal status, had seats at stake, but many constituencies saw no voting because the authorities could not provide the requisite security. And that besides, the 2008 constitution reserves 25% of the seats in each house for the military. Now, the junta insists that the elections were free and fair, but few external players agree. The polls were largely designed to support the military government's efforts to gain legitimacy. And as widely expected, the Union Election Commission declared the military-backed Union Solidarity and Development Party, USDP, the winner, with an overwhelming majority of the seats contested. Such a victory was never really in doubt, as any parties representing a meaningful challenge to the military were prevented from participating in the elections. In Thailand, there was on February 8 a snap general election and a referendum to decide whether a new constitution should be drafted to replace the 2017 version. And both of these were linked to promises that Prime Minister Anutin Janvirakul, leader of the conservative Bumjatai Party, made to the reformist People's Party in return for its support in the House of Representatives for his rise to the premiership last September, after the Constitutional Court removed the Pheu Party's Paetongtarn Shinawatra as Prime Minister. The People's Party was at that time the largest player in the House. So Anutin pledged not to try to form a majority government. The People's Party remained in opposition, and he also promised to call snap elections within 4 months of delivering his administration's policy statement and to pursue constitutional reform. Now, the Election Commission of Thailand set the date of the parliamentary polls in mid-December, soon after the Royal Gazette announced the House's dissolution to pave the way for them. And then in early January, it announced that the referendum would take place on the same day. Now, interestingly, in the lead up to the elections, opinion polls suggested that the People's Party could outperform Bumjatai, raising doubts over whether Anutin would be able to secure a full term. However, Bumjatai achieved an emphatic victory. The official results have yet to be confirmed, but Bumjatai is a clear winner, albeit without a majority of the 400 parliamentary seats contested based on first past the post voting. Another 100 seats will be distributed through proportional representation. Bumjatai is set to join hands with Pheu Thai as it builds a governing coalition to cross the majority threshold. Whatever the exact makeup of the coalition, Anutin looks set to preside over a more stable government than seemed likely before the polls. And as for the referendum, the preliminary results indicate that a sizable majority of voters have backed the idea of drafting a new constitution. So moving to the South Asian polls, Bangladesh also held a general election and a constitutional referendum simultaneously. That was on February 12. The much anticipated parliamentary polls were the first since Sheikh Hasina's ouster as Prime Minister amid a major uprising against her government in 2024. The poll schedule was announced in December. Now, security was tight given the many instances of political violence in recent months. Reasons for flare-ups and unrest were weak party discipline and strong inter-party rivalries. Voting day itself was relatively free of turmoil. Now, according to the existing electoral system, 300 of Parliament's 350 seats are won through direct election based on first past the post voting, and 50 are filled by women elected by the directly elected MPs through proportional representation. Now, an interim government led by the economist and Nobel laureate Muhammad Yunus, formed soon after Hasina's fall from power, was responsible for running the country until a new government could be formed after the elections. And that new government, sworn in today, as it happens, is led by the Bangladesh Nationalist Party, or BNP, the arch-rival of Hasina's Awami League, AL, and the emphatic winner of last week's polls. The BNP, returning to power after more than 20 years, won more than 2/3 of the seats at stake, and allied parties won a handful of seats between them, topping up the alliance's total. Bangladesh Jamaat-e-Islami, which, as the name suggests, is an Islamist player, was a distant runner-up, although it achieved its best ever seat tally by far, and some of its allies also won seats. The AL did not contest the elections, having had its activities banned and its registration suspended last May. So BNP chair Tariq Rahman is the new prime minister. He's the son of the late Khaleda Zia, the long-time party chair and a 2-time former premier. Zia, who had been ill for years, died in December, just a few days after Rahman, her son, returned from years of self-exile. And as regards the referendum, more than 2/3 of voters backed the July Charter, which reflects the consensus reached between the interim administration and numerous parties regarding constitutional reforms. the Charter's provisions must therefore be implemented. And lastly, we come to Nepal, where a general election will take place on March the 5th. Nepal, like Bangladesh was, is currently under an interim government formed in September after KP Sharma Oli resigned as Prime Minister under pressure from Gen Z protests. The demonstrations were predominantly organized by young people, as the label for them suggests. And the protests were sparked by a ban on various social media platforms, which was lifted soon after the agitation began. However, they came to manifest public anger over a wide range of issues, including alleged government corruption and the heavy-handed measures used by security personnel against protesters. Many government buildings and other properties were set on fire. The agitation involved individuals and groups intent on causing disorder, in addition to genuine demonstrators. And overall, over 70 people were killed. Now, Sushila Karki is the interim Prime Minister, appointed following discussions between President Ramchandra Paudel, top army officers, and protest leaders. Her popularity was evidenced by informal polling conducted on the Discord online platform. She's the only woman to have served as Nepal's Chief Justice, which she did for around 11 months until June 2017, when she reached the mandatory retirement age of 65. And then she became a staunch anti-graft activist. Now, soon after appointing Karki, Paudel dissolved the House of Representatives, which is Parliament's lower house, and announced the election date. The polls, as is customary, will feature both first-past-the-post voting and proportional representation. And a figure increasingly under the spotlight is Balen Shah, who resigned as Kathmandu mayor in January in order to contest the polls, just under a month after joining Rabi Lamichane's Rashtriya Swatantra Party, or RSP, which was the fourth largest player in the dissolved House. Balen, as he is widely known, will be the party's prime ministerial candidate. More established parties, such as Oli's Communist Party of Nepal, Unified Marxist-Leninist, will also be contesting, despite the popular anger manifested against those players during the September protests. And intriguingly, Balen will challenge Oli directly in the Japa 5 constituency in Nepal's east. So that's definitely going to be a contest to look out for. So that's hopefully a very quick rundown of the 4 elections.
Beg your pardon. Thanks very much, Joydeep. I mean, I think to sort of detached observers, these 4 elections might appear to be sort of slightly discrepant and sort of with their distinct circumstances. But it seems from what you say that all of them were really tied up in questions about tests to the health of the electoral and democratic systems involved, and also amid expectations of significant movement on reform, or at least the hope of that. How do you assess that sort of reform picture and that question about the vitality of those democratic systems as a whole?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are indeed various issues to consider regarding domestic politics in light of the polls. And I think 2 overarching themes that stand out are reform and trust. So more specifically, constitutional reform, and the question of which players are being trusted to deliver what voters want. So if we start with Thailand, Bumjatai's victory suggests that heightened nationalist sentiment following last year's border clashes with Cambodia was a key factor in the elections, with reform perhaps a secondary consideration. Really, it was the People's Party that's been the main proponent of constitutional reform. Bumjatai supported the referendum, but it doesn't back revision of the constitution to the same extent. Meanwhile, nationalist feeling is indeed running high. So there were 2 rounds of hostilities between Cambodia and Thailand in July and December, respectively, linked to their long-standing dispute over border demarcation. And bilateral tensions continue to simmer despite the latest ceasefire, with each side accusing the other of violating the agreement. Now, Bumjatai has undoubtedly benefited from its tough rhetoric regarding defense of Thai interests. But I'd say it would be a mistake to think that all voters backed it for reasons of nationalism. Much of the electorate may see the party as the best bet to help steer the country through the economic headwinds that abound. So when Anutin assumed office in September, he appointed several technocrats to his cabinet to help manage the economy. Voters were doubtlessly aware of that, and in his second term, he will likely continue on this path. Now, Bhumjatai was widely criticized because of shortcomings in the way the authorities responded to major flooding in the South late last year. But it did gain credit for steering Thailand's negotiations with the United States on a framework for a reciprocal trade deal agreed in October. And Puatai, who, as I said earlier, looks likely to be in government with Bhumjatai, can also highlight recent experience of shepherding the country through difficult economic times. So earlier in 2025, when it was leading the government, Thailand managed to negotiate down the rate set for it within US President Donald Trump's so-called reciprocal tariff scheme. So in addition to the question of reform, the economic challenges ahead are formidable. Thailand's estimated GDP in 2025 and projected GDP for 2026 put it among the lower performing economies in Southeast Asia. And notably, the central bank said in January that declining competitiveness was a problem. It cited the US tariffs and the strong baht as factors likely to hurt exports. Now, like Bhumjatai in Thailand, the BNP in Bangladesh will be expected to focus on both putting the economy on a surer footing and pressing ahead with constitutional reform. I think a difference in the two situations is that the pressure regarding reform may be greater in Bangladesh. Thailand's process of charter change is only at a very early stage, and we can come back to that later maybe because it's very complicated. Whereas the implementation plan of Bangladesh's National Consensus Commission requires the post-election parliament to enforce the July Charter's provisions within 9 months. Now, there's been some suggestion that voters in Bangladesh were not adequately informed about just what constitutional changes were in the pipeline. But a handful of the Charter's provisions were expressly mentioned on the referendum ballot paper, including an increase in the president's powers, term limits for the Prime Minister, a shift to a bicameral parliament, and increased representation in parliament for women. Now, regarding matters beyond reforming the constitution, the BNP, with its Bangladesh First slogan, notably pledged better services and reduced corruption during the election campaign. With respect to social protection, it proposed a family card to channel financial assistance to households and a farmer card to support the agricultural sector. These programs were clearly designed to appeal to both urban and rural constituencies, although doubts continue to abound over their fiscal feasibility. And improving law and order will be another major challenge for the BNP-led government. According to the Dhaka-based Human Rights Support Society, there were more than 900 incidents of political violence in 2025, resulting in over 130 deaths and over 7,500 injuries. So more generally, the key point is that voters seemingly trusted a party that belongs to the old guard to deliver the change they seek. The National Citizen Party, which is a party that emerged from the student group that spearheaded the anti-Hasina protests and which contested the elections as part of Jamaat's alliance, performed somewhat underwhelmingly. Although the BNP has not governed since 2006, it does have governing experience, and that was probably a key consideration for many voters. In Nepal, the trust equation seems rather different, because I think a win in next month's elections for an old guard party would likely anger many of the young voters who helped topple the previous Nepali government. Now, I mentioned Balin in my introduction. His popularity could bolster the RSP's chances of defeating more established parties. He's aged just 35. He has degrees in engineering and actually became famous as an artist on the Nepali hip-hop or Nep-hop scene. He became Kathmandu mayor in May 2022 after winning the mayoral contest held as part of that month's Kathmandu municipal elections. But as I said, he's now stepped down from that post to focus on these upcoming polls. Now, Balin ran for the capital's mayoralty as an independent, so campaigning on a party ticket is a new experience for him. And the party leader that I mentioned, Lamichane, he has served as Home Minister and Deputy Prime Minister, but despite that, the RSP leadership generally lacks political experience. So Balin may not help remedy that, but he should at least strengthen the party's appeal among the Madhesi people of the Tarai, which is a region that borders India. So he was born to Madhesi parents who moved to Kathmandu from what is now the province of Madhya Pradesh. And Jhapa district, where he's challenging Oli, is part of the outer Tarai within neighboring Koshi Pradesh. So in these elections, I think Gen Z loyalties will be divided across numerous parties, promising a better alternative to the coalition that formed the previous administration. But the thing is that many of the new parties contesting the elections will simply not have had the time to build a base and compete meaningfully with established players such as Oli's parties. But most young voters will demand a government that takes a tougher line against corruption and pursues constitutional reform. So if the elections result in victory for a party or alliance associated with the long-standing political class, post-poll protests may occur and could turn violent, potentially leading to a repeat of the sort of turmoil seen last September. And lastly, with Myanmar, really, there are a few issues of reform and trust at play. The military will prepare to transition to a more favorable manifestation of the government system it upended in 2021, which affords it considerable governing power. So it looks like Parliament will convene in March to elect a president, with the new government then assuming office in April. The Presidential Electoral College comprises 3 committees, 2 representing the respective parliamentary houses, and 1 made up of military-appointed lawmakers. So each advances a candidate. The winner becomes president, and the other 2 individuals become vice presidents. In addition to one of either the 2 vice presidential posts or the presidency, the Constitution gives the military the leadership of the Defense, Home Affairs, and Border Affairs ministries. So the new president will probably be Junta Chief Min Aung Hlaing, who is currently acting president. And meanwhile, for the military, the USDP will be a far more acceptable leader of the civilian portion of government than the National League for Democracy, which is the party it ousted from power in the coup and then banned in 2023. And Min Aung Hlaing will be helped by a new entity called the Union Consultative Council, which is designed to oversee both the civilian portion of government and the military. Basically, the body will control things ranging from legislative processes to national security, and that will allow Min Aung Hlaing to relinquish nominal leadership of the armed forces as he takes up the presidency without really ceding any influence over them.
Thank you very much. Just before we turn to Thomas and Japan, 2 quick follow-up questions for you. First, Thailand. Thailand, if memory serves, is not a stranger to constitutional reform processes. It's got a long track record in this area. What, if anything, is different about this particular movement? And then secondly, on Nepal and the Gen Z movement there, that, of course, grew into life at a time when other Gen Z movements around the world were emerging in places as far away as Morocco and other parts of Southeast Asia, I think Philippines and maybe Indonesia. To what extent do you think the movement in Nepal was, as it were, globally connected and part of a self-conscious movement, or was it something pretty much sui generis, but with a similar label?
Yeah, we'll start with a question about Thailand. I think it is an important point to underline that Thailand is no stranger to the process of reforming the constitution. I think there have been something like 20 since the 1930s. And actually, perhaps the question should be, is it different at all from these previous efforts? And I think, one thing to underscore is that it's going to be a very slow process. And in fact, I think this also applies to Bangladesh to an extent, insofar as neither country is likely to see a process as quick as proponents of change would desire. Now, Thailand's process is very complicated. So in September, just days after Anutin took office as premier, Thailand's Constitutional Court ruled that 3 referendums in total are required for charter change. So really, this is just a start. So you need a first referendum to determine whether the public supports the drafting of a new constitution. Then you need a second, which can be combined with the first, but of course in this case wasn't. That's on the revision's principles and methods. And then you need a third to approve the final draft. And the ruling also stipulated that the drafters of a new constitution cannot be directly elected. So in December, lawmakers approved the establishment of a 35-member constitution drafting committee and a 35-member public participation committee. And then the cabinet finalized the wording of the first referendum's question. So actually, that's something that's a little bit different. We have a clearer process that has been set out, and arguably a more restrictive process. But now that the first referendum has succeeded, presumably a second and third will follow, or at least they're meant to follow. But they will probably take years, not months, to materialize. And the drafting process will be highly contested. So the People's Party appears keen on reform of the first two chapters of the Constitution, which cover the general nature of the Thai state and the monarchy. But neither Bhumjatai nor Phua Thai will consider this. In Thailand, the monarchy remains a revered institution, and the military also retains considerable political influence. On the Nepal question, I think the protests certainly gave inspiration to so-called Gen Z movements in other parts of the world. But I don't think there was necessarily much evidence of coordination between them. So it very much was a case of providing inspiration rather than a very clear template to follow. I think the other important thing to point out about Nepal is that it has, over the past 2 decades, had unstable governments. So it's not surprising that a Nepali government should fall. It just so happens that in this case, it wasn't political maneuvering that brought down the government, rather it was youth protests. So definitely, I think other parts of the world will be closely following the outcome of these elections to see if there is any sort of follow-up on what happened last September. But as with a lot of things, I would underline that it is important to see these different movements and these different situations in their own context. That's definitely important in the case of Nepal.
Thank you very much. Thomas, can we now turn to you and the snap election called by Prime Minister Takaichi? Set out for us the background and the stakes, as it were, and the degree to which this has upturned politics in Japan. You're on mute.
Hello.
Okay, we can hear you now. Yep.
Right, brilliant. So yes, Japanese Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi unexpectedly last month called a snap election for February the 8th, gambling on her cabinet's popularity, which is currently polling far higher than her Liberal Democratic Party, or the LEP, the reputation of which is still affected by a political funds scandal that emerged in 2023. Her party's power eroded even further under the tenure of her predecessor, Shigeru Ishiba, which saw the LDP lose its majority in both the lower and upper houses of parliament. Takaichi's gamble paid off, with the LDP securing a supermajority of 316 of 465 seats in the lower house, reviving a party that had looked all but moribund a few months ago and garnering such a majority for the first time in Japan's post-war history. Meanwhile, the LDP has offered a cabinet post to its coalition partner, the Japan Innovation Party, or JIP, which has accepted the offer, reflecting increased confidence in the LDP compared to the conditional support offered when Takaichi won her party's leadership contest and premiership in October of last year. The cabinet is otherwise expected to be largely unchanged, and the result augurs the first period of stability since then Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's resignation in 2021. A protege of Abe, Takaichi espouses similarly expansionary fiscal policy and assertive foreign policy. By contrast, the main opposition Constitutional Democratic Party, or CDP's, decision to merge with the former LDP coalition ally, the Komeito, to form the Centrist Reform Alliance, or CRA, has backfired, reducing that alliance seat tally from 167 to 49, and the CDP seats more specifically from 144 to 21, shedding many experienced lawmakers. The alliance and CDP's futures are uncertain. Meanwhile, the JIP grew by just 2 seats to 36, while results for other smaller parties were mixed. The center-right's Democratic Party for the People, or DPFP, failed to reach its target of 51 seats, gaining 1 for a total of 28. The Japanese Communist Party's seat tally dropped from 8 to 4. The left-leaning Reiwa Shinsengumi dropped from 8 seats to 1. The nationalist Sansei Ito, advocating anti-immigration policies and skepticism of climate change, increased its seats from 2 to 15, and the new team Mirai Party, which supports e-democracy and has been characterized as technocratic, grew from 1 to 11 seats. Since her victory, Takaichi has signaled her policy priorities, including suspending the 8% sales tax on food and drink for a 2-year period, starting in late 2026. Constitutional revision, potentially including of Article 9, which enshrines Japan's pacifism. A, quote, responsible and aggressive fiscal policy, details of which are unclear, and a 10% reduction in the size of the lower house. I'm happy to move on to the domestic policy implications of those pledges, if that's called for here. You're on mute.
Yes, thank you very much. As you alluded, I think there are two areas where Takaichi has raised some expectations of policy shifts, even if the details have yet to be released in full. And one concerns, I think, economic reforms, and the others that you mentioned related to the constitution. What do we know about that, and what might be the prospects there?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the pledges that I just mentioned on her policy platform, Takaichi's supermajority will provide significant lawmaking leverage. It'll reduce opposition hurdles and facilitate a lot more rapid policy implementation or execution on, not just the 2 points that you mentioned, but a number of other points as well. However, Takaichi will not have completely free rein, given that the LDP remains in the minority in the upper house, and there continue to exist fiscal sustainability challenges amid Japan's enormous public debt and potential public scrutiny via referendums for constitutional amendments also. So all of those things will still prove to be constraints, even with this parliamentary supermajority. In terms of the pledge to suspend sales tax for food and drink, that is very likely to go forward and would boost reduce household inflation pressures, induce a consumption rebound, likely to benefit Japanese and multinational retailers, supermarkets, and food processors, while downside financial risks are likely to be mitigated via Takaichi's emphasis on sustainable funding. Indeed, Takaichi has emphasized reviewing subsidies, special tax measures, and boosting non-tax revenue to compensate for the loss of revenue from these taxes, rather than covering the shortfall by issuing bonds. She deems this a short-term solution, pending broader tax system reforms and elimination of regressive social insurance premiums. A bipartisan national conference will report on long-term reforms in the first half of 2026. More contentious proposals, however, such as the revision of Article 9, which could involve enshrining the country's self-defense forces status in the constitution and loosening the renunciation of war, may need to wait until after the next upper house election in July of 2028, as this would require a 2/3 supermajority in both houses and a simple majority in a public referendum. Indeed, it would be challenging to form an alliance of small parties in the upper house to support such revisions. From a domestic perspective, a revision of Article 9 would normalize defense spending and streamline SDF operations, bolstering cohesion amongst conservatives but risking demonstrations by peace activists. Takaichi will also likely count on defense spending boosts to fuel economic growth. Japanese defense contractors and foreign arms exporters could benefit from an amendment via procurement hikes and joint projects. Takaichi's fiscal policy will likely take the form of extensive stimulus, which will drive the economy towards 2% growth through wage hikes and investment, but also risk inflation and yen weakening. An initial indicator will be whether Takaichi maintains current plans for the fiscal 2026 budget, which promises the first primary budget surplus in 28 years. Ultimately, this could benefit Japanese exporters and infrastructure bids for both Japanese and foreign companies. A 10% cut to the size of the lower house could be approved, but with delays. The idea has critics in the LDP and is slated to be considered by a cross-party national council that will examine related issues, including restrictions on or measures to boost the transparency of political donations. If enacted, it could streamline governance and reduce costs, with faster policymaking potentially increasing regulatory clarity for businesses. Tougher immigration controls and policies on foreign nationals will likely at least partially neutralize the threat from the right-wing populist Sanseito party, which is hardline on these issues. Indeed, the CRA's election failure and relatively strong performance of the Sanseito underscore a broader rightward shift in Japanese politics, much of it driven by younger voters. In the meantime, Takaichi will need to not just preserve the LDP's coalition with the JIP, but potentially even cooperate with the DPFP. The LDP's landslide victory overall could make it more difficult as well for party leaders to maintain their grip on the now larger contingent of LDP lawmakers. Previously, LDP Diet members would join a faction which would provide guidance for new legislators. These factions also provided a structure through which the LDP could exert control. Most factions were dissolved, however, in late 2023, leaving an organizational vacuum, but they could plausibly re-emerge in some form. However, Takaichi is unlikely to be challenged given her personal popularity and will probably remain premier for at least the duration of the current Diet session, lasting until early 2030, particularly if she adeptly handles lingering fallout in relation to her party's political funds scandal.
Okay, thank you for that. You mentioned the constitutional reforms, which is in a way a segue into the foreign policy questions that we now want to address, because the provision of Article 9 would have those implications. Let me turn back to Joydeep to kick us off on this foreign policy discussion. I think the sense is that of the two elections that most touch on foreign policy implications is possibly Myanmar and Bangladesh. If so, can you tell us why that is and what you think the trajectory is in both of those cases?
Yeah, so I think of the four countries that I've been discussing, the two in which issues of geopolitics linked to elections are most interesting are probably Myanmar because of the ASEAN factor and Bangladesh because of the India factor. Although there are also important things to say in this regard about Nepal in relation to India-China competition and Thailand in relation to the country's tensions with Cambodia. So I can say a word or two about those as well. But starting with Myanmar, I think how ASEAN reacts to the post-election situation in Myanmar could have a considerable bearing on perceptions of the organization's relevance. So ASEAN underscores ASEAN's centrality in the region, but it has faced much criticism over the past 5 years for its inability to impact Myanmar's crisis positively. Now, ASEAN bars junta officials from high-level meetings, and it continued to insist in the lead-up to the elections that its 5-point consensus, or 5PC, plan for Myanmar should take precedence over elections. So the 5PC involves, among other things, having a dialogue between all relevant parties. Now, among all external players that refuse to support the elections, the key consideration is going to increasingly be whether to engage with the new government in a bid to help ease the crisis. In other words, whether they should be pragmatic. So the UN Special Reporter on the situation of human rights in Myanmar said just a couple of days before the last election phase that states endorsing the poll results would be, in his words, complicit in the junta's attempts to legitimize military rule through a fabricated vote. He urged the international community to keep isolating the junta and to extend that approach to what he described as the proxy government emerging from the elections. But I think certain countries may avoid explicitly recognizing the results while dialing down their efforts to isolate Naypyidaw. simply because they calculate that the only alternatives are either to sit back while Myanmar's rival forces fight out the civil war or to back the resistance. And neither of those things is likely to hasten an end to the turmoil. So much may indeed depend on the evolving position of ASEAN, which the Philippines is chairing this year. The Myanmar situation was discussed at an ASEAN foreign ministers retreat in the Philippines towards the end of January. And the Philippine Foreign Secretary told reporters that ASEAN had not recognized the elections due to a lack of consensus on the matter. But she also indicated that even a certain compliance in implementing the 5PC would make things move. And Thailand's foreign minister, for his part, said there could be a sort of calibrated re-engagement involving benchmarks. So if ASEAN deems Naypyidaw to be taking the 5PC more seriously under the new government, it may argue that re-engagement is the best way forward. And that, in turn, could convince the likes of the EU, the United Kingdom, and Australia to reconsider the hardline they have taken on Myanmar. And of course, all the while, China and Russia, which have been important sources of support for the junta, will sustain close ties with Naypyidaw. Now, moving on to Bangladesh, I think a key consideration for the BNP-led government there will be whether and how far to seek an improvement in its relations with India. Now, these relations are strained because of Hasina. She remains in India, to where she fled after being forced from power in 2024. And last year, she received jail sentences for corruption and was even sentenced to death for crimes against humanity, in absentia, of course. But Delhi has refused to consider Dhaka's calls to extradite her. Now, amid a rise in both anti-India sentiment in Bangladesh and anti-Bangladesh sentiment in India, each country has expressed concern to the other about the security of its diplomatic missions on the other's territory. And then in a virtual address at a public event in Delhi last month, Hasina made scathing remarks about Yunus, the head of the interim government. She even called for the administration's overthrow, saying it was incapable of holding free and fair elections. Dhaka notably said that it was surprised and shocked that she was allowed to make such a statement. And, the strain is also reflected in sport. So the 10th edition of the men's T20 World Cup, which is a major international cricket tournament, is currently going on in India and Sri Lanka. But Bangladesh last month withdrew from the tournament, citing security concerns about playing in India. So that's where we're at. But Delhi and Dhaka seem eager to pursue a rapprochement. So India's foreign minister attended Zia's funeral in December. And as Prime Minister, Narendra Modi congratulated Rahman on the BNP's election victory. And the BNP, for its part, has at least signaled its interest in a resetting of ties. But a rapprochement is going to be easier said than done. The BNP has certainly indicated that it will continue to demand Hasina's extradition. Delhi, meanwhile, is unlikely to change its stance on that issue, since it's not going to want to give the impression of abandoning a long-time friend. So I guess the challenge for the two sides may be to find some sort of middle ground. India may promise to ensure that Hasina makes no further statements that Bangladesh perceives as inflammatory, and Bangladesh may, in turn, quietly ease the pressure to extradite her. But, that would be risky for the BNP, because the opposition and much of the public really wouldn't settle for such a compromise. So I said I'd also say a quick word about Nepal and Myanmar regarding geopolitics as well. In Nepal, I think India and China will follow the upcoming elections closely, because each will be determined to maintain its influence over the Himalayan state. Now, the Nepali Communist Party's leader, Pushpa Kamal Dahal Prachanda, was notably among the politicians that visited India last month. He, like Oli, the ousted premier, is a former prime minister. And India's national security advisor told him during a meeting that elections were the best way to safeguard Nepali democracy. The RSP's vice chair spoke at a seminar in India on India-Nepal relations following the Gen Z movement. Just to remind you, the RSP is a party that Balin has now joined. Now, the party leader, Lamichhane, has projected Wagle, who spoke at this seminar, as the finance minister if the RSP wins the elections. China, interestingly, has seemingly grown more concerned about the situation in Nepal since the Gen Z protests. One source of consternation is the apparent involvement in those demonstrations of individuals calling for Tibetan independence. And additionally, Beijing did not take kindly to the Dalai Lama sending a message of congratulation to Karki after she became interim premier back in September. But whatever the situation, clearly Delhi and Beijing will ensure that they have robust links with players from across the political spectrum so that they can be ready to engage purposefully with whatever government emerges from the elections. And lastly, Thailand. The incoming Thai government will want to focus on the many governance challenge it faces, but a return to hostilities with Cambodia cannot be ruled out. As I suggested earlier, the latest truce remains fragile. And there have been some interesting developments in recent weeks. So a few days before Thailand's elections, Cambodia's Ministry of Foreign Affairs reported that Cambodian Prime Minister Hun Manet had written to French President Emmanuel Macron to request that France provide historical and technical documents pertaining to the border between Cambodia and Thailand. So according to the ministry's press release, Hun Manet sent the letter in response to a French indication of readiness to give access to such documents. And he also requested French technical expertise and advisory support. So France first mapped the border when Cambodia was under its colonial rule. So an interesting development, but Phnom Penh's request to Paris will undoubtedly make containing Cambodia-Thailand tensions even more challenging. Bangkok is going to reject any intervention that it deems partial towards Phnom Penh. Paris, for its part, will probably tread warily, keen to support efforts to find a peaceful resolution to the situation, but obviously wary of antagonizing Bangkok and encouraging more criticism of France's colonial legacy. So yeah, that fragile ceasefire between Thailand and Cambodia is definitely an important thing to watch in the months ahead.
Thanks very much. And Thailand, Cambodia, of course, both members of ASEAN, perhaps being a case where there was a tension between ASEAN's sort of posture of non-interference in internal affairs and its aspirations to be a problem solver among its members. But anyway, let's before we go any further, turn to Thomas. Thomas, the new government in Japan, or the continuing government, I suppose we should really call it, of Prime Minister Takaichi, has two big things to wrestle with in foreign policy. One is to keep the relationship with the United States roughly on track, and the second is to address what remains a festering row with Beijing that has some implications for Taiwan. But why don't you take us through the prospects for Japan-US relations first?
Yeah, I'll actually go into the foreign policy implications of Article 9, which or revisions thereof, which would be a big determinant of what Japan's relations with the United States and China will look like going forward. So from a foreign policy perspective, the revision of Article 9 would mark a major hardening of Japan's security posture, bolstering alliances with the United States, including Quad and AUKUS integration, as well as deterring China and North Korea. While Japan's trend towards militarization has already long moved upward without a formal constitutional amendment, it would remove ambiguity about whether the SDF constitutes war potential, weaken the minimum necessary force interpretive constraint, which limits the SDF's size and equipment, and probably normalize broader capabilities, including long-range strikes and expanded joint operations. However, this would not dramatically increase the SDF's force size. Instead, it could facilitate a qualitative boost in terms of missile, air, maritime, ISR, space, cyber, and unmanned air systems. And from a doctrinal perspective, it could advance Japan's power projection capabilities, justify retaliatory strike doctrine, and expand joint operations frameworks. However, this will be tempered by caution towards overt militarization, budget competition with social welfare, industrial capacity limits, and burden sharing with the United States. Indeed, Takaichi's relationship with US President Donald Trump is already positive, with Trump supporting her before her victory and congratulating her afterwards, and Washington is likely to welcome further moves by Japan towards shouldering more of the defense burden. With more legislative power to realize her foreign policy agenda, Takaichi will maintain robust diplomacy with the United States ahead of a US visit in March and beyond. That includes being able to more rapidly follow through on Japan's pledge to invest $550 billion in the United States, which should mitigate the risk of Washington reinstating higher tariffs to pressure Tokyo. Conversely, an Article 9 revision would likely escalate tensions with Beijing, which are already elevated due to Takaichi's refusal to retract comments suggesting Japan's military could be deployed overseas under a right to collective self-defense in scenarios such as a Chinese naval blockade of Taiwan. Beijing would probably frame such a revision as further evidence of Tokyo's militarism, potentially responding via diplomatic censure, economic reprisals such as restricting rare earth supplies to Japan, and ramping up military activity in sensitive waters near Taiwan and the disputed Senkaku or Diaoyu Islands, as they're also known. Beijing's recent moves included banning Japanese seafood imports, exports of dual-use items to Japan, including certain rare earth elements as well, issuing a travel warning about Japan, discouraging Chinese students from studying in Japan, canceling Japan-related events, and launching an anti-dumping probe into Japanese exports of a chemical crucial to the semiconductor industry. The impact of these measures was blunted through economic diversification, following Beijing's past economic pressure tactics, and it backfired strategically by boosting support for Takaichi in the snap election. It is also not clear that Beijing achieved its likely secondary objective of using visible punishment of Japan to deter other countries from closer cooperation with Taiwan or the United States. However, it is notable that Washington's response to the situation was unusually muted, likely to avoid derailing anticipated China-US talks. Beyond China and the US, relations with South Korea and ASEAN will likely remain largely positive, even with an Article 9 revision and likely accelerated revision of Japan's 3 strategic documents, which aim to bolster deterrence, expand capabilities in new domains, build the defense industrial base, relax arms export restrictions, and raise defense spending to sustain 2% of GDP. Overall, an increasingly proactive and deterrence rather than defense-oriented posture, enhanced counter-strike capabilities, increased arms exports, and deepened minilateral frameworks will favor relations with the US while worsening ties with China. Indeed, Beijing will bristle at any revisions, which will be complemented by Takaichi's pledge to deepen the free and open Indo-Pacific vision, expanding security cooperation with global and regional partners, as well as to create a new intelligence agency and enact anti-espionage legislation, which will likely indirectly target China. These measures will advance Japan's militarization and position it as an assertive Indo-Pacific leader, reducing over-reliance on the United States by hedging diplomatic efforts against Beijing. At the same time, Takaichi will likely avoid visiting the Yasukuni Shrine, which memorializes some individuals deemed to be Japanese war criminals, anytime soon, as this could inflame tensions and erode goodwill with both South Korea and China. Takaichi will overall strive to avoid worsening ties with Beijing in particular, given the continued importance of trade and investment relations to Japan's economy.
Thank you. That's an important point, and always worth remembering that China and the US are the top trade destinations for Japan. So the task of managing and balancing that relationship is an increasingly tricky one, and we will have to see how US-China trade relations develop for the way in which Japan might need to adapt to that outcome. Going back to you, Joydeep, we were talking earlier about sort of ASEAN's internal effectiveness, but there's also a different function which ASEAN has, which is in a sense to provide a collective grouping for the region to engage other big powers from more of a position of strength than they would be if they tried to deal with them on an individual basis. In respect of the US and China, what sort of a job do you think ASEAN is doing there? Obviously, they're getting caught in the cross hairs a little bit. They're subject to transshipment restrictions on Chinese goods. There's a South China Sea dispute with China. How do you assess that overall picture?
Just unmuting myself. Yeah, so obviously the key thing to remember about Southeast Asian states is that they're always keen to demonstrate that they're not picking a side between the United States and China amid their strategic rivalry. Most regional players seek good relations with both Washington and Beijing. But obviously, since Trump's return to the White House last year, Southeast Asia's ties with Washington have become less stable, not least because of the tariffs. I think on this issue, it's difficult for ASEAN to present a united front. And in fact, we've really seen individual ASEAN states all pursuing their own negotiations with Washington in a bid to reduce their tariff burdens. So you'll remember that last July, as part of a sweeping scheme, Trump announced rates ranging from 10% to 40%. And many of the countries in Southeast Asia at least managed to negotiate down the rates earmarked for them in April. But as you mentioned, the transshipment tariff is another major problem for the region. Lots of the region's countries could be hit hard by the 40% rate. The measure obviously is mainly designed to target Chinese origin goods exported by third countries, although a mitigating factor is that Washington hasn't yet clarified its criteria for determining an illegally transshipped item. So, obviously these sorts of issues potentially provide incentives for Southeast Asian states to move closer to China and further away from the United States. But as I said at the outset, I think, most countries in the region, of course, there are one or two exceptions, but most countries will continue to want to strike that balance between the two sides and to play down the impact of great power rivalry. And that kind of feeds into the question about the South China Sea situation. Great power competition is something that a lot of Southeast Asian countries are wary of. And of course, 4 of the region's states are formal claimants in the South China Sea. In other words, they have competing jurisdictional and territorial claims with China and indeed Taiwan. Now, with the Philippines as ASEAN chair this year, one of the key priorities is going to be sort of making progress on finalizing a code of conduct for the waters between ASEAN and China. The Philippines is one of the Southeast Asian claimants, and arguably, well, there's no argument about it. It is clearly the most vehement in pushing back against Beijing's assertiveness. So I think this year you'll see ASEAN really prioritizing efforts to make progress with that code in an attempt to sort of mitigate the risks associated with that situation.
Thank you very much. And Thomas, we only have a couple of minutes left, but China doesn't have elections, but it does have legislative events. We've got the 2 sessions meeting coming up in March of its 2 main legislative bodies, which is expected to set out, amongst other things, a new 5-year plan. But I think our assessment is that in general terms, the attention of the leadership is turning inwards a bit under a variety of different pressures. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. I mean, President Xi Jinping's priorities really are on more domestic issues at the moment, and that's just clear given the sort of economic pressures that China still faces in the way of its economic slowdown, the long-standing property crisis, and deflationary pressures, involution, describing the drag on prices that this intense competition between domestic firms is causing, and a host of other issues, really. And beyond that, there is also the ongoing high-level People's Liberation Army purges as well, which of course escalated recently when there were the purges of 2 CMC. That's Central Military Commission members. And so Xi really has all his hands full with domestic issues, the domestic economy, and domestic military and defense matters. And so that's really where the focus is going to lie, likely with the 2 sessions coming up in March.
Thank you very much. So that might be an important restraining factor in terms of relations with Southeast Asia as well as Japan going forward. We are just about out of time. I'd like to thank both Joydeep and Thomas for your presentations and handling some questions. I'd like to thank everybody who has joined the call. Very much look forward to engaging with you on subsequent webinars. But for now, from Oxford Analytica and Dow Jones, thank you very much indeed, and see you soon.